Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that looks beyond the hype, the myths and the movies and explores the nuanced and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes and I'm joined as ever by my co-pilot and navigator, James Jeffries. This episode is part 2 of our marathon question and answer session. We've received so many questions, we just couldn't fit them all in. So a massive thank you to all of our listeners who've reached out via email, on our X and Blue Sky accounts, on Instagram, our Facebook group, and by messaging us directly on our website at nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. A massive hello to all of you and to everyone else who's listening. How are you, James, and what kind of a week have you had?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I've been doing some gardening, which means I haven't been laying mines in the North Sea. I've been planting and, getting ready for the summer. Lots of spring flowers coming through and a nice little distraction from the PhD. I found out today that I am back in Cambridge teaching, back at Jesus College this time, which is just a beautiful, beautiful campus, doing my World War II course. Slightly older students, before sort of 14, 15, these were about 16, 17. I did it about 3 years ago there and it was so good. Had some brilliant students on that. Also prepped for my Battle of Britain bunker talk, which when this goes out would have already happened, which is just me talking about the Battle of Britain on film. I do mention Bomber Command, of course. That is the bee in my bonnet where they should get a mention. So everything from Way to the Stars to the big one, Battle of Britain, First Light, to television as well. And I'm making sure that I'm getting airfix kits and a load of other stuff as well. Lots of mention of the Hawker Hurricane and, the typical stuff. He says while he's wearing a Spitfire T-shirt, I should add.
Yeah,
but anyway.
sold out. Yeah.
I've sold out, Anyway. How about you, Jane?
Well, speaking of being domesticated and gardening and stuff, I have actually, you'll not believe this, I have learned to sew this weekend.
Oh, wow.
With an actual sewing machine, and I have made a pair of curtains.
Brilliant, that's fantastic.
My life, this is like amazing for someone who's not renowned for their domestic abilities, I have to say. But I'm really, really proud of that. And so while we are here, while we're having our chit chat bit at the beginning, I just wanted to mention the passing of Len Dayton last week. Yeah, very sad news. I know that many of our listeners will be sort of big fans of his work, everything from Bomber to SSGB to all of his spy novels and everything. So that's pretty sad. He's an absolutely fantastic writer. SSGB was one of the first sort of
counterfactuals
that I actually read. I must have read it not long after it came out when I was in my early teens, to be honest. And it just absolutely blew my mind. I loved it. In fact, I've still got the original copy that I had back then. It belonged to my granddad, actually. I've still got it. And I do dip into it occasionally. So, and of course, we talked about Bomber and the impact that had in one of our earlier episodes with Adrian Bean, didn't we? Adrian was the radio producer who'd actually produced the BBC production, which was absolutely mind-blowing. It was fantastic. So, sad to hear. But if anything, it's inspired me to sort of get out my Dayton novels again and dig back into those, I think.
Well, that was the thing with Dayton is you've got Bomber, you've also got Fighter, you've got the fiction and the non-fiction books. He was a great writer. He was a great writer with words. He was fantastic. He was blessed to be able to write characterization and dialogue as well. And he knew his history.
Yeah.
What an absolutely incredible man. I'd love the Harry Palmer films as well. I remember watching those. And it was my mum introduced them to me, actually, because I was mad on James Bond, like so many teenage boys are. She said, you should watch the Harry Palmers. So really? It's very, very different, Funeral in Berlin. Okay, gave it a go. Fantastic. It was so good. Yeah. So, it was genuinely sad news. Yeah. I'm a massive, massive fan. And I think Bomber is the best of the best when it comes to sort of popular culture depictions of the bombing war. I think it's fantastic. As regular viewers will know, I don't have enough superlatives for what it does, from the multiple angles, the dialogue, the emotional depth. And, oh, God, I'd go on forever. But, sad news. Very sad news.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right, so let's press on with our questions, shall we? Do you want to read out the first one?
Yeah. So, yeah.
Attempt an answer.
Here we go. I love the questions, by the way, guys. You really do test us with this. It's fantastic. So this is from Darren Little on Facebook. Hi, Darren. Funny enough, I was chatting to him earlier today. So this is in two parts. I'll read the first one first. I've been doing some research for a local whose relative with 76 Squadron was killed in action in his Halifax on a raid in La Palis, to bomb the Scharnhorst nearby in July 41, I believe. I wonder if Jane or James knows more about it, and have you done a pod on this raid? I know we talked about it in the mind-laying episode, so I feel like this is one to pass over to Jane for a little bit of detail.
Right, so La Palis is probably better known or more often referred to as La Rochelle, where the big U-boat base is, basically. But there's also a big sort of dry dock and what have you there as well. And in 1941, Bomber Command were tasked with bombing the Scharnhorst, which was sheltering there. So when was it? 24th of July 1941, there's 15 Halifaxes from 35 and 76 squadrons carry out an unescorted raid on the Scharnhorst at La Palis. There was fierce fighter opposition almost immediately and some flak. 5 aircraft were lost and all the remainder damaged. So all of them were damaged. 5 direct hits were scored on the Scharnhorst, but 3 of these were armour-piercing bombs which went straight through it, leaving holes in the bottom only. The 2 bombs that did explode caused only light damage. The Germans decided that Scharnhorst should return for the better repair facilities and flat cover at Brest, and she sailed that night with lots of water inside the ship, obviously. Reports vary between 3,000 and 7,000 tons of water, and the operation was a major success in that it ensured that this warship was forced to stay in harbour for several months, being required for repairs. So that's from the Bomber Command War Diaries, the Operational Reference Book 39 to 45, which is absolutely fantastic. Martin Middlebrook and Chris Evett. One thing I wanted to mention was that, no, we haven't done a pod on the attacks on the Scharnhorst, but I think we probably should do one. I'm being inspired by listening to the We Have Ways thing about the Channel Dash and about all the attacks on the Kriegsmarine ships in France. And I think that would be something which we should perhaps consider for a future episode, because there was loads of attacks. Yeah.
Was this one of a daylight raid? Were the daylight raids?
I think it was.
Because I was researching for the Augsburg book, which is coming, folks, but my PhD is just absolutely a monster, taking over everything. And 97 Squadron raided in their Avro Manchesters before they switched to Lancasters in daylight. And it was just, can you imagine, especially in a Manchester?
So, on the same day, so there are similar attacks at Brest and at Cherbourg. So they're looking for the Scharnhorst.
Yeah.
And the Niger now as well. So these are all the ships which eventually end up taking part in the Channel Dash about 6 months or so later. So yeah, that's quite interesting. But I think one of the problems that the attackers encountered was that obviously the Scharnhorst is next to these submarine pens, so everything is concrete all around about it, so it's pretty well protected. There's very dense anti-aircraft defences. And the Germans also put up smoke screens during the attacks as well, so that they try and prevent Bomber Command from actually seeing the targets. So because of this, Bomber Command end up launching repeated high-risk raids, basically, and to try and knock out the Scharnhorst before it could return to sea. So, quite an interesting phase of the war, I think. Mm-hmm. And again, with regard to the La Palis incident that you mentioned at the beginning, yes, there was lots of mine laying done off La Palis. It was the Cinnamons minefield. I talk about a raid or a mine laying sortie operation to lay mines in the Cinnamon minefield in March 1944 in the Invisible Campaign. I also mention it in Above the Stars as well, because it was my uncle's crew's penultimate operation, and they had particular problems with being coned by searchlights, etc. So yeah, it's a bit of a dicey operation. La Palis, La Rochelle, not to be downplayed at all.
And something rather overshadowed, especially the daylight element and such, like just how much effort was put into them in that period. 1941 is kind of like that year that's, I hate using the word forgotten because it's so overused. But when you come to the narrative of Bomber Command is overlooked, shall we say, and there is a lot going on, probably because of the Buck report and the findings of it, of course. But yeah, that's not a reason not to talk about this by any means. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, people tend to concentrate on, I know we've done it ourselves, on what's going on in 1940 with the Battle of France and the Bomber Command's role in the Battle of Britain, etc. But yeah, 1941 does tend to get overlooked. Maybe we could do a special episode just on 1941 at some point as well.
I'm up for that.
That would be a good idea, I think. Yeah,
I like
put
that.
it on the list. Yeah, we'll do that.
I should add it to the list, yeah. Onto the list. I better go on to the second part of the question from Darren. And this is secondly with mine-laying operations. Immediately, Jane, there you go. She's smiling already. Were the aircraft specially set up internally to handle the different types of bombs, mines, incendiaries, etc.? And would they be quickly adapted to suit what type of operation they were to go on and where? Now, I know there's an element here of different types of aircraft had their limitations. I will give praise to the Lancaster because it did have that huge, massive, wide bomb bay, but it had racks. It wasn't restricted in the way that the Sterling was with the sort of payload that it could take, etc. But this is a mine-laying one, so I've got to pass it to you, Jane, haven't I?
Yeah. The short answer is that all Bomber Command aircraft were adapted so that they could take both bombs and mines, and that was from a very early stage in the war. So any new models, any new marks that came on stream, all had to be adapted to be able to carry both bombs and mines. So I think that gives an indication of just how important the mine-laying campaign actually was to Bomber Command. So initially you start with, it was planned that it was going to be the bolter from Coastal Command that was going to be laying the mines, but it quickly realised that it didn't have the range, it didn't have the power, and it could really only ever carry one mine. Then, of course, we start with the Hamdens. They are adapted to carry one mine each. Then we get to things like the Bostons and the Manchesters, and then eventually the Sterlings, Wellingtons, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Hudsons, Liberators, Swordfish, you name it, they carried mines. So, in terms of the sort of actual mechanisms of that, there were various different kinds of sort of racks and rails fitted to them. I mean, obviously, it's going to be different on a Swordfish or whatever, or even a Hamden, but it's compared to the larger, the heavy bombers. But they've all got rails and racks that the mines can sort of just be almost like just clipped into, kind of thing. So they could all do it. That's the short answer. Is that Darren? Yes, thank you.
If you want a longer answer, check out your book, I imagine.
Yeah. It lists all the aircraft that's been adapted to take mines. Although Jamie, if I did come up with another one when I was giving my talk at the International Bomber Command Centre a couple of weeks ago, and that was the Albacore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one which had escaped my attention. So well done there, Jamie. Yeah. So the next question comes from Joe Fox on Facebook. He says, following the excellent talk about physics and variables involved in dropping bombs by Matt Doncaster, it got me pondering about comparisons between the US Norden bomb site and the RAF sites, for example, the SABS and the Mark 14, and wondering if they were the right technology for their specific jobs, i.e. day, night, area precision, or if RAF crews and planners would have preferred the Norden, and if so, why wasn't the technology shared? This is a great question, which really gets right to the heart of how doctrine, technology, and operational reality really shaped bombing, I think. Do you want to chuck in anything first, James?
Yeah, I think the Norden bomb site, probably the most famous bomb site of the Second World War. A lot of that is because of, the Americans were pretty proud of it, and it, in tests, proved to be very effective. The RAF were after it. The Americans were reluctant to kind of share that, but it kind of ran away with its own legend. And the thing was, when it was tested, it was in Arizona deserts, in daylight, without fighters and flak shooting at you. And it was pretty accurate for what it was. But you then turn that into having to fly all over Europe, being shot at with smoke over the target and such like. It loses that ability. It was an incredible piece of tech. But the British were left, certainly at the start of the war, to kind of develop their own bomb sites and such like, and I think did a pretty decent job. But that's the whole thing with accuracy as well, and people think of, we now have smart bombs and missiles and such like. What was accurate in 1940 is very different, even to 1945, actually, with the developments. I didn't know this is something that we've talked about. But yeah, I think the Norden bomb sight, its myth has kind of run away from itself. But yeah, Jane, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, with regard to the Norden, I mean, it's designed for high altitude daylight precision bombing, and I'm putting precision in quotation marks there. So it's got like basically this sort of analog, I guess you call it a primitive computer system, stabilized platform, and a sort of autopilot thing. So the bombardier, as they called their air bombers, could fly the aircraft during the bomb run, but it needed clear visibility of the target. If you can't see the target, it's absolutely no good whatsoever.
Yeah.
Compare that with the British bomb sight. So the Mark 14, which I think was introduced mid-war kind of time as sort of the RAF standard. It's simpler, it's more rugged, it's easier to use. It worked with course-setting bomb sight lineage, but it was designed for night operations and area bombings. It's two different things, two different tools for two different tasks. That's the thing. You've also got the Stabilised Automatic Bomb Sight, SABS, which has been described in some places as the closest equivalent to the Norden. Yes, it was accurate, but it was very, very complex, very delicate, and could go wrong very, very easily. It was intended for more sort of precision attacks. So like on the V weapon sites and things that we talked about earlier. So you've got to look at what were the right tools for the particular job. So the US is concentrating mainly on daylight precision bombing. The Norden was extremely advanced for its time. In ideal conditions.
Exactly, yeah.
It was very accurate. Yeah, great. Pre-war tests are impressive. But in reality, when you're flying over Europe, you've got cloud, you've got haze, you've got smoke, you've got flak. You're not being shot at by the Luftwaffe when you're flying over Arizona in broad daylight, are you? Bombers often couldn't see the targets. Formation bombing reduced individual precision. And I think heavy defences basically made them, well, they were forced to compromise. They couldn't always bomb where they intended to bomb, which is a problem that the RAF had as well. So the accuracy, I think, was, shall we say, far worse than the hype. Often in reality resembled area bombing anyway. I know the Americans won't like to hear that, but it's true. Anyway, looking at the RAF then, they are obviously doing nighttime area bombing. The Mark 14 was perfect for the job that they were trying to do. It worked in darkness and poor visibility. It was simple, it was robust. It wasn't too complicated, so it was easy to train crews on. And it could be easily integrated into area bombing tactics. However, and this is a massive however, night bombing makes precision almost impossible anyway. And it's not until you really get your navigation aids, such as your G, your oboe, your H2S radar, that precision becomes more of a thing, if you like. So the bomb sight in itself is not the limiting factor. It's the difficulty of actually finding the target in the first place, especially when you're bombing at night. And the SABS, the other one, was technically excellent. It was very accurate in controlled conditions like the Norden, but it was too complicated for mass use and it needed highly trained crews in very stable conditions. So it's all right for kind of like special missions, but it's not your everyday, everyday trip to the Royal Valley kind of thing. Would the RAF have preferred the Norden? Probably, possibly, but maybe yes, no, I don't know. I'm going to say no, which is it wouldn't have solved their main problem because they were bombing mainly at night, not exclusively, but mainly. And obviously the Norden needed you to acquire a visual target. So unless you've got some sort of illumination or radar guidance or whatever, it's not going to make that much difference. So I think, why wasn't it shared? Well, the Americans were very, very cagey about it, weren't they? And they were very, very secretive about it. I've read somewhere that the bombardiers had to take oaths or something about...
I've heard that. I don't know how true it is.
I don't know how true it is either. So I don't know. I mean, obviously the Americans themselves believed that it gave them a real sort of decisive technological edge and it enabled, in quotation marks again, war-winning precision bombing. But how much of that is actually propaganda?
Absolutely, yeah.
Part of it, I expect. So I think we need to take a kind of reality check, really, about what could actually be achieved with the Norden and in terms of the different goals and different methodology employed by the two air forces. But yeah, I think ultimately the navigation systems were probably more important than the actual bomb sites ultimately, because what's the point if you can't find your target in the first place? But anyway, so summary, I think Norden, yes, it was good for its intended role, but that role didn't always exist in European conditions. The British Mark IV, less glamorous, but perfectly suited to RAF night area bombing. SABs, highly capable, but probably too specialised for widespread use. So each was great for its own individual purpose, but I think there's not much kind of cross-pollination going on there. So yeah, that's a very, very long answer, but basically, yeah.
We like long answers, especially when it's, sort of stuff. And yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about, I think that the propaganda and falling for their own hype and myth and bravado, which no comment about America and that. But yeah, I think that's quite telling as well. And I think that's had a post-war effect as well, actually.
Definitely.
And definitely in popular culture and media and such like. Anyway, I'll be slipping into our PhD then, talking about popular culture and media. Shall I move on to the next question?
Oh, I've got to ask the B part of this question, which is, how do you know you're talking to a Harrier pilot at a party? The answer is, don't worry, he'll soon tell you. I think that can be applied to just about any pilot, I have to say.
I was about to say that is any pilot. They'll soon tell you.
They are an unusual breed, shall we say. Right, okay, do you want to go on to the next question, which is from AD?
Yeah, so this is another great question. AD Bond on Facebook, Upside Down Book Club. Slightly odd question. In prisoner of war films, aircrew are often portrayed wearing caps and hats. How does such a headwear survive a bailout? Boots often came off. Would they be tucked into their battle dress? And it's a mixture of things, really. I guess there's an element of that, but I know that the Red Cross did supply some clothes and items. There are also supplies from the German authorities as well. And they would ideally mark the clothes. So if they were discovered, there would be a mark on them and such like. That's my understanding as well. And of course, not everyone who was captured bailed out. They might have been on the ground. I don't know. I imagine the vast majority, of course, were from the ground bailouts and such like. Yeah, that's kind of my answer to that, Jane. I don't know if you've got anything to add.
I've got a slightly different take on that. I think it's something that movies often simplify. I would suggest that most headgear didn't reliably survive a bailout, which is what he specifically asks.
Yeah.
And what you see on screen is more of a mixture of reality and storytelling convenience, if you like. Because when you think about what gear they're actually wearing, so you've got sort of your soft cap or side caps, sometimes peak caps, less common to be worn during flight. Flight helmets, very common. You're more likely to end up with your flying helmet and goggles on if you bail out rather than your peak cap or a nice soft cap at a jaunty angle. Flying boots or standard service boots, and then flying suits over your uniform. So you think about the realities of this. Bailing out of a bomber, it's not like a standard parachute jump. It's violent, it's chaotic. You're in a very strong slipstream with 100 to 200 miles an hour airflow. Sudden decompression, tumbling motion before your parachute deployed, risk of equipment being snagged as you exit the aircraft, etc. Basically anything that's not nailed to your head is going to very likely to be ripped off. So why do films show them wearing caps? I mean, obviously some did make it back to ground again if it was like tucked under a helmet or sort of wedged surely or tucked inside your flight suit or whatever. But I think the most realistic explanation is that it's a question of artistic license almost, and it helps distinguish between officers and other ranks. It helps sort of distinguish the characters, if you like, and it sort of gives this almost the expected military image that the viewers or filmgoers are expecting to see, I suppose. So in real life, I think it's going to be a bit messier. So your helmet's gone, your cap's gone, your goggles gone, your clothing's going to be all ripped. You probably lose your boots. Yeah, so I think that's about it, really. I think it's artistic license, basically.
Yeah. And there is the thing of you wouldn't have the same pair of underpants for 6 years or socks. So you would have things obviously supplied by the Red Cross. You would really hope that as well. I would not wish my worst enemy to have the same one pair of underpants for 6 years in a prisoner of war camp. That really is disastrous.
Well, he certainly learned how to darn their socks, didn't he? You always see that in films, don't there? There's always someone sitting there darning their socks. Yeah.
Well, there was that make doing men. There was the talent to make things and repair things. We've seen that in the escape movies for escaping purposes, but also for day-to-day things to make things last. So, yeah, absolutely. Shall I move on to the next question?
Yeah, this is a part B as well, isn't there?
Oh, it is part B. It's AD again. So when the lucky few aircrew survived their tour and didn't return to ops, what did they do? I think really, I've got a very quick answer, which is they went into training purposes. Some went and sold war bonds if they were popular. Guy Gibson did a tour of the US, and I know he trained and did lectures in Canada, for example. Big name to get out there. Rarer examples are you have aircrew in films. So you've got a Target for Tonight, I know has a lot of RAF personnel, but you've got the first of the few. I know it's Fighter Command. But you have veterans in that as well with lines and such like. So there's that propaganda element. But generally it was training, maybe a bit of a desk job as well. If they got a promotion, they could move on to being a station commander or such like. I think that, for me, more or less covers it. And is there anything you want to cover there, Joan?
Yeah, just to say, the vast majority would have ended up doing some sort of instructor's role for a period of around about maybe 6 to 8 months or so, longer if you were lucky. If you were not so lucky, as many weren't, you would be called up for a second tour after that point. And obviously lots of people did do a second tour, although the chances of survival, I think, were minimal at various points in the war. Others as well, I think some ended up going to other commands, particularly Ferry and Transport Command. I know that's what happened to some members of my uncle's crew. They all did a spell of instructing, and then the rest of them went to Transport Command. Apart from one who did a second tour, and he was killed on his fourth op of that second tour. But Jack, my uncle, he ended up sitting out the rest of the war up at RAF Kinloss, as I think it was at NOTU, Operational Training Unit, just as a wireless instructor, and he did that for the rest of the war. So he was quite fortunate not to be called up again to do another tour. But as I said, none of his crew were, and the only one who went for a second tour did it voluntarily, which is insane, really. But I guess he just missed operational flying. But
there's also the element of a sense of guilt as well. If you've been off operations and you see casualty figures, there's still a war to win, all these young sprogs going off and getting killed, and you're there training and you think this isn't right, I need to go off and be a part of this, that creeps in as well.
Yeah. But then again, plenty others would have thought, well, I've more than done
I've done my bit, feet up, or let's get on with training. And I've done my bit. That's it. I don't need to do any more. It's one of those things, isn't it? It always depends on the individual.
Very much so.
It's very much sort of with veterans as well. Some don't say anything at all. Some talk about it straight away. Others don't until they're coming near the end of their life and they want to share it. It just totally depends on the individual. And it's the same with this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. The next question comes from Steve Moss. Now, Steve Moss did send us a lovely photograph, which I'll try and share on our social media, which belonged to his uncle. And Steve said, I had this photo from my uncle who was ground crew, but he was released from the RAF to work for Avro. Is this something which actually happened or happened often? Any thoughts, James?
Clearly. It has happened. I don't know how regular it is, and specifically for Avro. Do you have more on this at all?
Yeah, I've looked into this a little bit. So during the war, some RAF ground crew and technical personnel were seconded or released to aircraft manufacturers, such as Avro, as well as to other firms in the aircraft industry. So this happened at sort of several different points throughout the war. It's mainly driven by urgent shortages of skilled labour in aircraft production and modification. So you've got, obviously, aircraft production needs extremely highly specialised skills, including airframe fitting, engine installation, electrical systems, instrument work, working on even the metal fabrication. Many of the men who possessed these skills had originally worked in the aviation industries, but then were called up, obviously, into the military, including the RAF, but some of them are then sort of released back. I don't think we're talking about massive numbers. It can't have been. But by kind of like late 41, early 42, many of the aircraft factories are lacking skilled workers. And by this time, the RAF have got quite a lot of technically trained personnel in ground roles. So I think what happened was that the Air Ministry allowed a few trained RAF technicians to be transferred or loaned back into industry. So I think that's basically the gist of it. But also you need to remember as well that large numbers of aircraft required almost continuous modification. So there's constant development going on, constant new marks being produced, constantly changing equipment in terms of radar, electronic countermeasures, armaments, and all sorts of stuff. For example, like a Lancaster was frequently modified for new equipment, so it's going to have its H2S radar, jamming systems, various bits and pieces. So RAF technicians were often seconded to factories or modification centres because they understood the operational requirements and maintenance issues, that they were going to be relevant. But again, I think many of these secondments would have just been temporary. I can't imagine them being there for the duration of the war. Also, many aircraft passed through RAF maintenance units before being issued to squadrons. And these units worked very closely with manufacturers because obviously the aircraft are just coming off the production line or whatever. And there's a very close relationship between the manufacturers and the RAF. Obviously, there has to be. So they're moving through RAF maintenance organisations, coming off the factory modification lines, going through testing. All of this helps to make sure that when an aircraft is delivered to the RAF, to its operational squadron, it is ready for operational service. And I think there's some overlap there between the ground crews and the guys who worked in the factories as well. Also, there was ground crew who worked on operational aircraft could provide direct feedback to manufacturers about sort of particular problems, particular issues, recurring mechanical faults, any particular maintenance problems, or any structural problems that they were noticing in combat use. And again, this helps the manufacturers to improve designs and speed up fixes and things as well. So yeah, I think that's basically the gist of it, if you like, to that one. But yeah, it wasn't something that I was particularly aware of until I looked into it.
Yeah. I'd be really interested, actually, it's very nerdy this, to look at the stats of where they went, how many did. I mean, the vast majority must have been instruction and training and such like, but how many did go into desk, how many went to factories, how many pilots worked for ATA or did test pilot roles or whatever. I'd be really interested in that. I bet someone's got that or done that somewhere.
There must be somewhere. There'll be some stats somewhere. Yeah. Right, do you want to do the next question?
Yeah, so this comes with an apology. Can't find the original email.
Yeah.
So apologies for that. But the question is, did crew members sometimes bail out prematurely? What happened to them? How were they perceived by the rest of the crew or squadron? Very, very good question. And it did happen. I know I've heard of a couple of examples. I mean, if you're over enemy territory, the repercussions are going to come later or it's going to be lost in the paperwork, so to speak. But I know Jamie talks of an example. This is where we need Jamie. Yeah. I think it was a Blenheim taken off from Bircham Newton in fog, and the pilot bailed out, and then the aircraft crashed, and I believe all of the crew were killed. And he did face a court-martial, but didn't get any repercussions other than, of course, losing his wings and such like. So I'd be very interested that there's more information on this. And I imagine, you're sitting in your tail turret potentially, and you've done one operation too many. It could even have happened, I guess, by accident. I don't know. But what were your thoughts on this, Jane?
I think it did happen, and it did happen not quite often, but it wasn't uncommon, put it that way. I think sort of in the heat of battle or whatever, you're flying over Essen, you're getting bombarded, you're corkscrewing to avoid searchlights, etc. You're seeing aircraft being blown up all around you. Some men just simply panicked, and particularly if the aircraft were corkscrewing or if they were taking evasive action or whatever. Some men just simply flipped and just bailed out. There's an episode in the 10 Squadron history from Brooklands to Bryce of a chap who did just that very thing. He just went, and I don't think anybody ever knew what happened to him. I think he was killed in the sort of in the overall melee, whatever. Never seen of or heard from it again, kind of thing. And obviously, his crew pitch up back at RAF Melbourne without him. The CEO says, well, where's Billy, kind of thing. Oh, he He'd had enough, he just went. So it did happen, certainly. But I think the vast majority of these situations would occur over enemy territory and while you are under attack. So it's not just a question of, bailing out while you're over home ground, coming down your parachute, then getting the bus back to the station. The vast majority of these bailouts, if you survived, would have been captured and end up as a POW. And obviously, by the end of the war, the crew's disbanded anyway. They've all gone their separate ways. You probably never see or speak to any of them ever again. So there probably weren't any particular repercussions. The only repercussion in those circumstances, I guess, is the guilt or feelings of the person involved. Should I have abandoned my crew? Did the rest of them end up bailing out? You might have thought that they were all going to. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the pilot might have said, okay, guys, we're going to prepare for bailout. And then he may have regained recovery of the aircraft or whatever, regained control. And they decide not to bail out. That's happened too. But by which time, your tail gunner's already gone.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a difficult one, really. But yeah, the short answer is it definitely did happen.
Yeah. That happened, actually. I just thought of John Hanna's VC in the Battle of Britain. In his Hampden, one of the crew bailed out. They were ordered to, but John decided to stay behind, put out the flames, and the pilot flew himself and John back because he managed to put out the fire.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, a lot to think about there, isn't there? Right, our final question for today. This comes from Jeff Harris, who sent his message in via the fan mail button on the website. One thing I have been wondering, says Jeff, is how did ground staff get allocated? Were they allocated by station, squadron, or some other way? Also, did they have a set tour of duty before being moved, like the air crew? Or once were they allocated, was that it? Were they just, there for the duration? That's a really good question, because ground crew are sort of much less discussed. We do try to mention them, but I think that the system behind RAF Bomber Command ground crew was highly structured and quite different from the tour culture of flying personnel. What do you think on that one, James?
Yeah, and it's initial reaction is thinking about measuring it. A tour, okay, yeah, X amount of operations done, dusted. Yeah, there's ins and outs, and there's certain things as the war develops, and some ops are, okay, that counts as half or whatever. And with fighter crews and such, like how many hours in the air and etc. But when it comes to ground crew, yeah, it's a little bit more complex, isn't it? Because they all do different hours of work, different types of work, different risks of danger, depending on what they're doing as well. Jane, do you have a definitive answer for this?
Yes and no. Again, sort of looking at my family experience, Uncle Leo Grock, who was an ERC at RAF Melbourne at 10 Squadron, he was there for the duration. He was there for most of the war, apart from when they had a detachment to Palestine, I think, which was in 42. And they were in Palestine for a few months. And then he came back, but he came back to Melbourne and he just stayed there, as far as I know. He may have ended up elsewhere very late on in the war, but he was certainly with 10 Squadron for the vast majority of the time. How common that was, I don't know. But so ground personnel are usually assigned to a specific RAF station or airfield, which hosted sort of one or more squadrons. So, for example, you might be posted to Scampton or Melbourne, and some of those stations could host multiple squadrons, like the bigger ones certainly did. So the ground crew belongs to sort of the station establishment, if you like, or a specific squadron within that station. So I think you've also got this confusion as well as ground crews being allocated to like one particular aircraft. Normally it wouldn't be just one, they'd have two or three that they'd be looking after. But they certainly did build very, very close relationships with the crews of those aircraft. But as well, remember, you've got a very high turnover of crews and you've got a very high turnover of aircraft. So you are not going to be looking after the same aircraft for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
It's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
Likewise, the same crew. A crew is only going to be there. Their tour is going to be an average of 6 months, and then new people will be coming in. But the ground crew are largely sort of staying the same. So they've got a very strong sense of identity with the squadron, with the base, but that they have a completely different organisational structure and rotational system to aircrew. So personal allocations to stations is organised by the Air Ministry, by RAF Maintenance Command, by the training units and the technical schools. And they decide where skilled trades are needed, and they decide where replacements are needed. For example, through accidents or bombing or whatever, people on the ground did get killed, and where they need to build up reinforcements for expanding bomber forces. Did ground crew have tours like air crew? No, they didn't. Obviously, we've talked in the past about aircrew having defined tours. They didn't at first, but they did later on in the war. But ground crew didn't have that, and they weren't rotated out based on how many operations that their aircraft had flown or anything like that. These were long-term postings. So in a typical pattern, I think you'd be posted to a station. You'd stay there for months, if not years. You could be moved if you were promoted, or if you were reassigned, or if you were medically unfit, or if the unit was relocated or restructured or whatever. But many ground crew spent the entirety of the war, or the entirety of their service, depending on when they were called up, at just a couple of stations. And that's certainly what happened to Leo. Did they get breaks? Yes, but not like aircrew. Aircrew had very regular leave, about once every sort of 6 weeks or so. The ground crew only had sort of the standard RAF leave system, so just basically when the operational requirements allowed. And this was often limited during peak periods. So, for example, 43, 44. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it, really. They were more or less tied to particular stations, I think, or particular squadrons. But yeah, they would not be moving around a lot, because obviously you are developing that technician's skills as well as the war goes on. The more aircraft that he works on, the more operational aircraft that he deals with, the more his skills develop, the more experience he becomes even more of an asset through the passage of time. And you don't want to get rid of that. You don't want to upset that balance. You've got this team of absolute experts on the ground there, keeping the place running, keeping the aircraft in the sky. And you don't want to be messing on with that. And I guess that's why most of them stayed in one or two places for the duration.
Do you think some of them would have been starting on biplanes, Gloucester Gladiators or Swordfishes, you mentioned earlier, and it could be on Gloucester Meteors at the end of the war? And I do think of my great uncle Ralph, who was an armourer, and he was on Spitfires for a while. He had certain flights that he was attached to. But he served in quite a few places, actually, including Iceland at Reykjavik, and he worked with the Americans there, yeah.
Wow,
and I got in touch with him at only a couple of years before he very sadly passed away, and he wrote out his whole service history in pencil, which I've still got, and a little relic, the ID plate from a Heinkel that was shot down in September 1940 near where he was training. He liberated it from the Heinkel, he said. And yeah, there's a wonderful picture of him with a bunch of scruffy Urks, as he describes them, laying on a wing of a Spitfire, and it's just, wonderful. So I was very, very lucky to talk to him before he passed away.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Wonderful. Right, well, that's pretty much the end of our questions for this week then. So again, thanks so much to everyone who sent them in. There've been some absolute belters. We're still getting some coming in. I've seen another one coming just there, pop up on screen while we've been talking. So we'll save some of those for the next series. This is our penultimate episode of this series, and we've got our final episode coming up next week, which I think we are going to be talking about the New Zealand contribution, which I'm really looking forward to, because that's something that we've not really touched on before.
We've got some listeners as well, haven't we?
We've got loads of listeners in New Zealand. Yeah, so we're going to be talking about that, and we've got some guests. It's proving quite difficult in terms of the timings, because obviously they're going to be speaking to us live from New Zealand. So there's about a 12-hour time difference, I think, but we'll manage. So really looking forward to that. But yeah, that's going to be the final episode of this series, because we're both knackered, basically. Yeah. James has got so much more important work to do on his PhD.
Yeah, it's a monster. Anyone thinking or has done a PhD will know this. It is, the last year. It goes into another gear, regular submissions and refining it. And I've got a draft in November to make sure that I can submit in January. And even then, I still might not finally finish, but I'm desperate to. But it's all hands to the pump, and I'm having to really focus all my efforts on that at the moment.
So we're going to be taking a break for a few months. We'll be back probably late summer, maybe early September. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
We may do a couple of odd episodes before then. I'm not sure how it's going to pan out, but we will be back at some point. So bear with us. I'm going to be getting on with my Norway book, which has been so sadly neglected of late. I'm determined to get that finished by the end of this year, about a third of the way. Well, I'm about 33,000 words in. So,
that's exciting.
Yeah. Once I get to about 40,000, 45,000, I feel like I'm coasting. Because my books tend to be quite short. I only ever write about 90,000 words. I'm a woman of few words, she said, having written down for like the past hour.
Well, the PhD's 80,000, but I've probably written the complete works of Shakespeare times 20 over the course of it because of all the rewrites and changes and goodness. But there's loads of things that I can work on and pick up in the future and such like. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we are going to be taking a little bit of a break, but we will be back later in the year. So thanks again for listening, everyone. We've thoroughly enjoyed debating your questions. It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed this session. Enjoyed last week's too. Yeah. So we'll be back. We'll see you all again next week. Thanks so much for listening. You know what to do in terms of subscribing, reviewing, etc. Please do come along and join us on our Facebook group for other chats and bits and pieces as well, or follow us on our social media. And we will see you all again next week. Thank you and bye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.